So I'm speaking to you from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories in East Vancouver, where I work as a human geographer and political ecologist, focused especially on understanding the title of my talk, The Political Economy of Extinction. The science on extinction is clear. Its top proximate drivers, its most direct drivers, are land use change followed by overexploitation. What is less certain and unfortunately less studied is the underlying or root drivers of extinction. For example, what political economic structures underpin that destructive land use change and overexploitation? And that's where I try to shed light in my work. Currently, I study woodland caribou. This is a species that's on a crash course to extinction in Canada. And I'm doing the research with my longtime pal and long-term collaborator, Jessica Dempsey. And in this project, we're trying to peer into the political economic structures underlying caribou extinction. Especially, we're investigating extractive development in endangered caribou habitat. So how and why the state authorizes this development and who benefits from it. We're also developing a theoretical approach to study extinction that borrows especially from feminist and post-colonial political economy. So in my talk, I'm going to focus especially on this theory, but I will draw occasionally on the empirical research, and I'm happy to talk more about our findings and methodology in the Q&A. I do want to start with an empirical moment of observation from the caribou research. It was 2018 and I was in Ottawa during a typical November week in that city. It was gray and hovering above zero. And over that week, the 17th annual North American Caribou Workshop drew hundreds of people to the city to talk and worry and grieve and plan and share resources about caribou. The situation for caribou on the continent is grim. Many populations have gone extinct in recent decades and more are projected to disappear within a few generations. At the conference, there was a presentation by the scientist who led the most recent national assessment of caribou in Canada, and her title was all caribou in Canada are at risk of extinction. The primary cause of this extinction or near extinction is extractive development in caribou habitat. So mines, roads, transmission lines, pipelines, and especially cut blocks. The conference was held in a big chain hotel downtown in those meeting rooms we're all very familiar with, and maybe we amazingly find ourselves even a bit nostalgic for these days. The tone of the workshop was somber. Over the several days, the very impersonal and sterile space of the conference was regularly kind of ruptured by very emotional, heavy moments. There were dozens of formal presentations and testimonies shared in Indigenous talking circles that attested to the catastrophic loss of caribou for Indigenous people. This is a loss of vital knowledge, a loss of a family member, a loss of a way of life. There were a lot of tears and great frustration was expressed, but not idle frustration. So Indigenous presenters also described, dozens of initiatives their nations are leading to arrest caribou loss. They're penning pregnant caribou to protect them and their calves from predators. They're conducting extensive caribou monitoring programs with youth and community members. They're carrying out independent management plans. They've implemented voluntary moratoria on caribou hunting in their territories. Meanwhile, though, on and around these territories, this industrial extractive development that's driving caribou loss is booming. Literally, thousands of wells are being drilled in critical caribou habitat in Alberta. Hundreds of cut blocks have recently been approved in caribou habitat in BC. The particular moment that sticks with me came at the tail end of a session when we watched a documentary film called Bringing Them Back. The film documents West Moberly First Nations and Saulteaux First Nations efforts to prevent the extinction of endangered central mountain caribou in Treaty 8 territory. This is in northeastern BC. The film focused on a maternal pen that the nations run called the Clinsay pen. And this pen involves 24/7 guardians watching over the pen. It involves the community members hand-picking 400 large bags of lichen per year to feed the penned caribou. In the audience discussion after the film, Jean Lomcourt, a Dene woman from Fort McKay First Nation in Northern Alberta, spoke up. She praised her fellow Treaty 8 nations' efforts, but she expressed her frustration with how small these efforts seemed as she watched industry spread in her own territory while caribou disappear. And she used a metaphor to capture this. "We're in a whirlpool," she said. "It feels like we're going around and nothing happens. The losses just keep spiraling." Lomcourt's whirlpool metaphor is, to me, a key starting point, an opening into a grounded theory of extinction. The metaphor invites us to think about how there is a kind of momentum towards extinction. It certainly feels as if this momentum exists these days as we swirl towards what the writer James McKinnon calls the 10% world, a world with 10% of the abundance, liveliness, and diversity it had, a world of paltry salmon runs, dead quiet forests, a world more and more the same, a world with a profoundly reordered distribution of life. What does this new composition of life on Earth look like? Well, a couple of years ago, systems biologists published a mind-boggling paper. They modeled total animal biomass on Earth and found that today, of all mammalian life on the planet, only 4% are wild animals. The rest are domesticated animals and humans. Of birds, only 30% are wild. This is due to what scientists call a biological annihilation of wild animals. Species extinction levels today are, as you probably know, 100 to 1,000 times higher than background rates. Wild vertebrates have declined by an average of over 60% since 1970. So the combination of these skyrocketing extinction rates, the ascent of domesticated animal life, and the global mixing of species via colonial and globalized trade flows have precipitated what geographers Lewis and Maisland call a global homogenization of Earth's biota. It is as if biodiversity and many wildlife species on Earth are caught in Lomcourt's whirlpool. A whirlpool occurs at the meeting of conflicting currents. These forces, originally moving in different directions, begin to flow in unison, creating a powerful formation. In other words, these different forces form what Stuart Hall calls a conjuncture, a balance of forces that is achieved between a collection of relatively autonomous sites, political, economic, cultural sites that articulate with each other. For Hall, any crisis within a conjuncture has multiple conditions of existence. So a crisis like runaway species loss must accordingly be analyzed intersectionally in terms of the multiple structures and logics that intersect to drive the loss. Scholars are identifying some of these structures and logics, and I'll just briefly outline a few. One of the currents in the whirlpool has already been hinted at, and a big one, colonialism. Potawatomi scholar Kyle White reminds us that the environmental crises we face are not an accident, not the result of systems gone awry. He writes, quote, "Settler ancestors wanted today's world. They would have relished the possibility that some of their descendants could freely commit extractive violence on indigenous lands," end quote. The reordered world of earthly life is a world that in many ways colonialism sought to create, a world where native people and wildlife would be replaced by settlers and their superior domesticated animal imports. One of the clearest examples of such a purposeful extinction is buffalo across the North American plains, a case people are probably familiar with. Buffalo were driven to extinction as an explicit part of genocide against indigenous nations who depend on buffalo. Their extinction, the extinction of buffalo, also represents what Cree scholar Tasha Hubbard calls a genocide against buffalo. And there are many other examples. Here in BC, where I am, the colonial project long involved the attempted eradication of vermin like cougars and wolves, who were for nearly a century subject to death by bounty. This kind of improvement by domestication, by eradicating wildness, may seem archaic, out of step with a more, well, frankly, romanticized vision of wilderness and wildness that we have today. But this logic of improvement is still alive and well. We don't have bounty hunters anymore. Instead, we have the Wildlife Service in the US or conservation officers here in BC. But their job and the job of a massive pest industry is still this kind of civilizing policing of animal life. Wildlife management, not necessarily bent on eradication anymore, still involves the removal of millions of animals a year, animals who largely threaten property, like domesticated animals. Another part of the colonial project of improvement that is part of the whirlpool is the replacement of reciprocal economies with extractive ones. Under Indigenous rights and title, the Canadian state is obligated to protect Indigenous economies, to protect Indigenous people's access to hunting and culturally significant species like caribou who provide food, medicine, manufactured items, clothing, and regalia. And yet, the Canadian state consistently abrogates this responsibility in favor of authorizing extractive development that erodes Indigenous economies that depend on healthy caribou herds and broader ecologies. A member of West Moberly First Nations, Bruce Muir, describes such authorization of extraction as environmental racism. It reflects a profound disregard, a denigration, really, of ways of life and knowing that are technically protected, in his case under Treaty 8, and yet are regularly trampled on, and in ways that the government's own courts have recognized and overturned, quashing the permits for extraction, for example. Extraction, of course, leads us to consider another current in the whirlpool, which is commodification and profit seeking, bringing us more centrally to the realm of capitalist activity. So in Treaty 8 territory, for example, the transformation of mountaintops and forests into discrete tradable objects like coal, lumber, oil, and gas. This is a key current in the whirlpool. And Jess and I, our research is investigating these industries, as I mentioned, trying to figure out who the beneficiaries are, who's benefiting from caribou extinction, really. So far, we've only been able to look at coal mining in central mountain caribou habitat. This is Treaty 8, again, the region I've mentioned. But we've been shocked, really, to find how paltry the benefits are that materialize from coal mining compared to what's promised in mines' environmental assessments. The main beneficiaries of these mines appear to be shareholders who buy and sell coal mining company stock at the right time. So financialized capitalism is also a part of this story. I'm happy to talk more about that research in the question period. Okay, so I've moved pretty quickly through some currents of the whirlpool, and there are more, of course. But what I want to do now is stop with commodification and step back and think about commodification a little bit longer, because this is really where classic political economic accounts of extinction focus. So there aren't that many political economists who work on extinction, but the ones that there are highlight how the commodification of nature reduces a world of complexity and interconnection to a world of objects, discrete exchangeable units that in many cases then experience extreme depletion. There's an example from a book I just finished that I want to flag. The book is called Red Gold and it's by Jennifer Teleska, and it's about the managed extinction, as she calls it, of giant bluefin tuna. Teleska argues in Red Gold that the story of bluefin tuna near extinction is a story of what she calls the tragedy of the commodity. The book is about how bluefin tuna are made commodities and with what consequences. And part of Teleska's effort in the book is to account for all the beauty and mystery of bluefin tuna, who she describes as, quote, a beating muscle, a world traveler, indispensable in webs of life, tearing through salted water like a bullet, end quote. All of this beauty and mystery falls away as tuna are made into stocks to be managed as data points in the geoeconomic game of global commodity trade. And science is marshaled towards this goal. Teleska concludes, based on her observations at international meetings, that, quote, fisheries scientists were not the guardians of the sea, restraining the industrial expansion. The science produced was grafted onto a conception of marine conservation intent on securing the inventory of fish for the growth of export markets. not to ensure an ocean full of giant bluefin tuna and other creatures of the sea. Of course, as Teleska acknowledges, the bluefin is not a widget, not a cog in a well-oiled machine. And yet the managers, traders, scientists, and bureaucrats remain bent on managing her and her kin this way, as products divisible by units to be processed. So ultimately, Teleska implicates the commodification of tuna and their attendant objectification, made into objects, as a key driver of their global demise. In this account, and others like it, we witness how, as Troy Vettese describes, capital seeks to transform flora and fauna into machines, or transform them into what Kenneth Fish calls living factories. So these natures that are made machine, made factory, made commodity, these are the natures that capital sees, that capital directly values, even if just through the cold, reductive logic of a money price. This is a huge part of the whirlpool, as Teleska and others argue. But I want to suggest that if we're trying to understand the political economic whirlpool of extinction, a focus on nature-made commodity or made machine is too narrow. So what is missing from that account? Recall that the leading proximate driver of extinction and declining wildlife abundance is land use change. In Canada, that is the top threat for 80% of listed endangered species. Now, land use change is a bit of a euphemism. What it means is that the conditions of life for wild animals are being eroded, right? They're losing habitat, food, space in which to move. They're losing the ability to provide for themselves and their kin, much like commodified animals do. But these wild animals experiencing land use change are likely themselves not commodities. Their loss is rather collateral damage of capitalist activity. And woodland caribou are a perfect example here. Caribou are not commodified. They are not even harvested anymore in the regions I've been discussing. First Nations like West Moberly and Soto have had voluntary moratoria on hunting in place since the 1970s. So woodland caribou are not being over-harvested like bluefin tuna. They are instead losing their life worlds, right? They're losing the socio-ecological conditions necessary for their existence, from lichen meals to the ability to hide from predators in the forest. So caribou, unlike tuna, are natures that capital does not see. They are superfluous to capital production, at least as far as that production is concerned with its very short-term blinders. Capital is not seeking to make caribou into machines or living factories. Caribou are quite conveniently, actually, outside the economy as it is classically understood. Given that the largest proximate driver of extinction is land use change, it is crucial to consider what political economic structures uphold the depletion of this outside realm. So if we're interested in understanding how and why capital depletes these non-commodified life worlds, where can we look? Well, we can look to scholars for whom capitalism's outside is of profound importance to the functioning of capital. In particular, feminist and post-colonial political economists have long excelled at theorizing this outside realm, and scholars of extinction can learn from them, I think. Basically, what these scholars say is if you want to understand how capitalism operates and how capitalist exploitation works and what effects it has, you cannot just look at waged labor and class. There is a whole other world of capitalist exploitation that underpins wage labor exploitation. And I'll say more about this in a second. But what I really want to suggest is that there's a parallel point to be made when it comes to understanding capitalist natures, the forms and functions that nature takes under capitalism. If you want to understand capitalist natures and nature's exploitation under capitalism, you cannot only look at nature in the commodity form. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to propose another current in the whirlpool, the flip side of the commodity coin, the flip side of value, that side which capital does not see or sees in its peripheral vision in a sidelong glance, that which is uncommodified, unpriced. How do we characterize this realm? What do feminist and post-colonial political economists turn our eyes to if not only nature-made valuable, nature-made machine, nature-made commodity. I suggest, borrowing from these political economists, that we can make two moves to address the limits of a strict commodity focus. And I'm going to describe each move in turn. The first move is to consider not only nature-made factory or machine, but also nature-made household. Feminist political economists have long drawn our attention to the unwaged, non-commodified, reproductive realm, one that does not typically officially count as constituting the economy, but is actually crucial to economic functions and relations. The household is an exemplary space within this realm, a space in which this kind of reproductive work is conducted, the cooking, cleaning, and caring that is often unwaged and cast as outside the economy. I want to suggest that nature and the work of nature is also frequently cast in this reproductive realm. I'm going to explain this via a political economist who has long included nature in her analysis, Maria Mies. So Maria Mies actually has an iceberg model of capitalist patriarchal economies that she offers us. And I've drawn it up because I didn't want to use slides. So I drew it on the whiteboard. I hope people can see it. This is a bit weird, but so this is Maria Mies's model of the iceberg to represent the economy. What you see here is that there is an above water and a below water. The above water much smaller than the below. The above water and the below water correspond to a division of labor, a gendered division of labor, that for feminist political economists is a foundational element of capitalist social relations. At the base of the gendered division of labor is a separation of work into productive and reproductive spheres. The productive encompasses what we typically think of as economic, right? Producing commodities, remunerated with wages, carried out in factories or office towers. This is the visible part of the iceberg above the waterline. The reproductive sphere is found in the invisible underwater part of the iceberg, and it dwarfs the above water. This work includes the work of social reproduction or life's work, creating and maintaining social bonds, the work of raising children, caring for the elderly, often in private domestic spaces like households, right? These reproductive labors not only produce future workers for the above water, but also all the daily necessities that refuel those workers, meals, cleaning, nursing back to health. Importantly, this work is typically naturalized as women's work, right? It's largely unpaid. It's seen, as Nancy Fraser says, as being performed for the sake of love and virtue as opposed to money, or it's seen as being sort of instinctual. Importantly, Maria Mies does not only include the gendered work of social reproduction underwater, but also the work of colonies and under it all, nature. By including colonies underwater, Mies is nodding to a vast literature that I won't do justice to here, but it's on how colonies, both formal colonies and in some cases former colonies, colonized territories and people, have their labor power, subsistence production, and raw materials either looted completely or extracted at the lowest possible price. And then finally, Mies includes nature as the largest and furthest underwater piece of the iceberg. Here she refers to how capitalism depends on what Jason Moore, 30 years after Mies, calls cheap natures. These are natures that are low cost or even free inputs into capitalist production. Think of the bees that perform pollination of crops here, or natures that receive, absorb, and process waste, like wetlands that filter water. For feminist political economists, this underwater realm is as necessary to capital accumulation as the exploited working class. Together, the human and non-human bodies, energies, and materials of this submerged invisible iceberg supply cheap or unwaged labor and cheap or free inputs and energies that are productive. Capitalism depends on this deeply undervalued work. So what exactly does capitalist exploitation of that submerged realm look like? Well, we know that wage labor is, at least according to most political economists, wage labor is exploited by capitalists who do not pay workers the full value of their labor. The underwater realm, for Mies, is not exploited, but super exploited. It's not even compensated by a wage. And here, it's not labor time for commodity production that is appropriated. In the super exploitation of the underwater realm, capitalists appropriate what she says is the time and labor necessary for people's own survival or subsistence production. Nancy Fraser more colloquially refers to this as capitalism free riding on the life world. So not only humans' time and labor for their own survival is appropriated in the underwater realm, but non-humans as well. When it comes to non-human super exploitation, capitalists appropriate the time, labor, and materials necessary for their survival. So what does free riding on the life world of caribou look like, as an example? Well, as we know, caribou are part of and have their own relations involved in the general production of life or subsistence production. Specifically, caribou's own means of reproduction include, relations with undisturbed standing forests of trees and lichen. There are, intricate sociobiological processes that give rise to these forests and to caribou and other beings. Other network practices are happening in these forests, including the slow composting of carbon to produce oil. Capital appropriates elements of this life world. This happens when some parts of the life world are moved above water as they are harvested, for example, and commodified, like when trees become lumber. It also happens when grasses and waters absorb toxic runoff from mining. It happens when oil, composted over millennia, is extracted. What this amounts to is that the conditions of caribou's subsistence activities, their own subsistence activities, are robbed from them, appropriated by development for markets in coal, gas, timber, and so on. In general, then, capital depletes this below water life world by siphoning off and appropriating the energies and materials dedicated to the reproduction of life itself. In this way, the relegation of some bodies, lives, and materials to the underwater realm or to the outside is crucial for value production. And so then feminist political economists often start to ask, if the formation of this underwater world is as central to capitalist social relations as the creation of the working class, then how is this underwater world formed and held in place? This brings me to the second move that we can make to address the limits of a commodity focus in a political economy of extinction. The second move is to consider not only valuation, but also devaluation. So more than being interested in formally valued commodified wage labor, as I've been saying, feminist political economists are interested in the condition of being unwaged. How is it brought about and maintained? Why do certain bodies and energies persistently occupy this unwaged realm? To do this, they first denaturalize the placing of certain bodies under the waterline. They argue, for example, against the idea that women naturally perform social reproductive work. And instead, they point to the role of patriarchy in delivering gendered hierarchies of roles and worth that place women and their work outside the economy. This is also a parallel point has been made by generations of post-colonial and critical race scholars who emphasize how capitalism depends on others constructed as different and worthless, especially through racist narratives and ideas, right? So as scholars like Ruth Gilmore argue, capitalism relies on violently enforced, abstracted difference to devalue those it exploits or whose energies it appropriates: racialized people, colonized and enslaved people. Racism essentially delivers the difference that capitalism needs and justifies the inequality that it creates. Collectively, these political economists are directing our attention away from biologically rooted explanations of hierarchies and towards understanding various logics of devaluation, where devaluation is, I think, helpfully broadly conceived not just as a reduction in exchange value, but as a broader loss of worth, right? Logics of devaluation are the material and semiotic practices by which others are made lesser, subordinate, denigrated. When it comes to understanding the emaciation of nature, this reordered 10% world, these logics of devaluation include patriarchy and racism, and also anthropocentrism. So most definitions of anthropocentrism tend to focus on it as a social relation or ideology, a set of ideas mostly, right? And practices to some extent. One in which humans are placed at the center of all the action as the agents of history, politics, culture, and then the wider world is just a passive backdrop. Humans are not only at the center, but they are masters of and superior to all other life, and non-humans are rendered inferior and subordinate. This is, of course, a big part of what anthropocentrism is, but I suggest that anthropocentrism is best seen as that set of social relations that I've just described with material foundations. The material foundations of anthropocentrism draw our eye to how devalued animals form a crucial material base for capitalist social relations and wider human relations too. This material base of anthropocentrism is formed in part by the non-human commodities that I've talked about, that world of commodified nature, the bluefin tuna managed as stock. The ability to turn complex living beings into alienated objects that can be bought and sold for profit. This is obviously a crucial part of the material base of anthropocentrism. But the material base of anthropocentrism is also, following Mies, comprised of humans' super exploitation of non-human subsistence production, free riding on their life worlds by intervening in their reproduction or denying animals access to their own conditions of life. So what I'm really getting at here is that capitalist production relies on the ability to not only commodify non-human life, to place an exchange value on non-human life, a money price on it. It also depends on the ability to devalue natures such that they and their life worlds become disposable, whether or not they are commodities. In the research we've done, we repeatedly see such sacrificing of caribou, their treatment as cheap or disposable, even, and this is really important, even within processes and institutions that profess to value caribou, like environmental assessment processes that are supposed to yield major developments with minimal harms to endangered species like caribou. So we've done a deep dive into environmental assessment, looking at all the assessments for major projects with potential impacts to caribou. 65 of them over the last 20 years across Canada. Of these 65 major projects, 64 were approved. Some of the justifications, so what we were really interested in is how is the state justifying approval of projects with impacts or potential impacts at least to an endangered species. Some of the justifications were not surprising. Baldly economic benefit is the key, one of the key justifications. Although, as I've mentioned, we're researching whether or not those benefits materialize and finding that less does than is promised. Another justification across the board to move ahead with these projects is that they bank on mitigation measures that will supposedly render impacts insignificant, even though the efficacy of these mitigation measures is completely unproven. Another justification that we found was more surprising. In several projects, the effects to caribou were deemed to be insignificant because the project area was already considered so degraded and disturbed. So, this area has already been logged, so there are hardly any caribou left, so we might as well go ahead and put a coal mine on top of this mountain. It'll get rid of the last bit of caribou habitat, but there's already so little left. So remember that these projects are being approved by a state that lists caribou as endangered and is legally committed to their recovery. Yet this same state denies caribou access to the resources necessary for their survival by authorizing the super exploitation of caribou's subsistence production. And it does so by relegating caribou to a position of disposability over and over again. Caribou already live in degraded lands. They're already mourned and buried. They're not worth enough to counter the economic promises of mining companies. They're not worth enough to need to prove whether mitigation measures will actually work. In this way, anthropocentrism, this relegation of caribou to this position of disposability, forms a significant current in the whirlpool. Yet, surprisingly, anthropocentrism has featured little in political economic theories and studies of extinction. To me, it should be as central as patriarchy is to the question of reproductive work and its exploitation. All right, so summing up, let's recall Lumcour's metaphor of the whirlpool of extinction and how it conjures a sense of the relentlessness of extraction and loss, the momentum towards extinction, almost as if extinction has a life of its own, but it doesn't. I've argued today that the whirlpool has many currents that articulate, like colonial improvement and capitalist commodification. Political economists, as I've said, have tended to focus on the latter, on the violence wrought by commodification. And that violence is enormous. Natures made into living factories can be quickly exhausted as their being becomes redirected, not to their own survival and the survival of their kin, but towards profit-making and human consumption. But as I've suggested, I think the focus on nature-made factory or machine is too narrow. As I've argued, the political economy of extinction must look beyond just commodified natures. Just as feminists and post-colonial theorists argue that capitalism and labor exploitation can not only be understood by looking at wage labor. In addition to the exploitation of commodified natures, then, capitalism, as I suggest, also involves the devaluation of the whole uncommodified socio-ecological reproductive sphere, the whole underwater of the iceberg. And this is a crucial current in the whirlpool. When we're trying to understand the devaluation of this uncommodified realm, anthropocentrism is a core logic. Anthropocentrism has a material base that is central to capitalist social relations, and that base is comprised not only of commodities, but also the state-sanctioned appropriation of uncommodified non-humans' life worlds.